I'm a former law enforcement officer. I spent about 10 years in law enforcement, including some time as a training manager for a department. And I started to notice that with scenario-based training and simulator-based training, that I could really dramatically impact the outcome of a call, and whether or not an officer used force just by the information that I provided them going into the call. So that started to make me question, well, how much does information influence that decision-making process as an officer is dealing with it? How does it influence the way that an officer interprets cues that they're seeing in real time? Other researchers have talked about kind of the frames of a call. So there's the early frame of a call, there's dealing with the call, and there's the after effect. And not a lot of time has been spent in that early frame. We've kind of talked about, well, officer planning and how they get there, but that information exchange that takes place both from the public to the dispatch center, and from call taker centers, and from the call taker center to the officer is really very important. Essentially, what we did is we took 300 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, multiple states, and we gave them one of 3 dispatches at the very beginning. So one dispatch was kind of a standardized dispatch. We told them that someone was looking at their neighbor's house who they knew was away on vacation. They saw somebody walking around the house. The person, they gave a description of the person, and that was really all the information that kind of the control group of officers got. We had another group of officers who got that same STEM dispatch, along with an update that said the person appeared to be talking on a cell phone. We got a third group of officers who got that control dispatch, and an update that said the person appeared to be holding a gun. So we had 3 groups of officers. They were randomly assigned. They had essentially the same information, just with a slight change. Then we put them through the simulator, and they were randomly assigned to one of 2 simulations. One simulation presented a person who matched the description from the call with their hands in their pockets. After interacting with the person for a very short period of time, the person rapidly produced a cell phone from their pocket and kind of pointed it at the officers in a way to film them. The second simulation was exactly the same. Everything was the same. Person had their hands in their pockets. They interacted with the officers for a short period of time before rapidly producing a gun out of their pocket and pointing it at the officers. And we looked at differences in responses. Now, all of the officers started with their guns drawn and pointed at the person, because there had been some previous research that indicated that even with a very short period of time that it takes for an officer to draw their firearm, that can negate any influence of any kind of priming effect that might be there. But in this case, the officers started with their guns drawn, and what we found, pretty startling results. For the control group, we found about 28% shot the person who rapidly pulled out the cell phone. Now, again, this is a simulator environment. They're expecting a shoot, no shoot decision. It's likely elevated from what we would see in the real world, but 28% of experienced officers shot the person who produced a cell phone. The people who got the cell phone prime, the person appeared to be talking on a cell phone. That was all the additional information that they had. That rate dropped down to almost 0. Only 3 officers shot the person who produced the cell phone. The group that got the gun prime, that increased over 100% from our control. It went up to over 62, or right at 62%. So we saw dramatic changes in our officers' response and the likelihood for making an error under those circumstances when somebody produced a cell phone based on the information that they were provided. Now, something that doesn't appear in that study, and it wasn't part of the study plan, but something that I did as part of the study, was I asked all of the officers after the fact why they had made the decision that they did. None of the officers involved said that the dispatch information had any influence at all. All of them identified the motion from the pocket or their ability to identify the cell phone in the person's hand as the reason that they made the decision. And so it's clear to me that officers are not aware of the influence that dispatch information has on them as they're making the decisions. But it's clear that it does have a tremendous influence, particularly in that split-second decision environment. My mom and dad my dad was a doctor and my mom was a nurse. And one of the things that I can say, my dad passed away in 2008, but one of the things that I can I can say for a fact he was a good doctor. In fact, he was a very good doctor. He moved up very, very quickly within the kind of the hierarchy of the hospital. I know that because of the way that other doctors interacted with him. I know that because we got Christmas cards from his patients every Christmas from people he treated and people he saved. But I also know that my dad killed people. I know that based on my dad's decisions, not because they would have died anyway, that people passed away because he made mistakes over the course of his career, not intentionally, certainly, but he made mistakes. And one of the things that got me thinking as I worked in policing, and this is as I was a police officer and as I've studied policing after the fact, is looking at how medicine responds to those things. And they respond very, very differently. I can't imagine walking up to a doctor in the ER after a patient has died because of a medical error, handing them a card and saying, you better call your attorney because you're going to be criminally and civilly or criminally and administratively investigated. That approach would preclude us from learning from these bad outcomes. That approach would actually stunt the growth of medicine and prevent us from growing. And it would also be a horrible way to actually look at a system's outcome, right? If we only use a criminal and civil lens to look at that, that's very narrow. In fact, all we come to at the end of that is whether or not the doctor committed a crime. We don't actually look at why the event occurred. And so I wanted to take a broader lens to these things. Tamir Rice happened in 2014. The shooting of Tamir Rice happened in 2014. And that impacted me as well as we looked at this event that clearly was systemic in nature. We only looked at it through the lens of a criminal and administrative investigation. And that goes all the way up to the Department of Justice and all the way down to the prosecutor and the grand jury that made the final decision in that event. And that was for the dispatcher as well, right? We didn't look at this from a systems perspective to understand why. We didn't look at it to say, why did it make sense for an experienced officer to do what they did in the moment? That's not to say that this wasn't a tragedy. It was a tragedy. But why did an experienced officer do that? Why did a very experienced dispatcher do what she did in that moment? And until we start to understand that, we're not actually going to improve outcomes. We can put people in jail, and maybe we should. We can fire people, and maybe we should. But at the same time, we're not learning anything from that event, and we're not improving the next outcome. We feel a sense of justice and relief from that, perhaps. But again, we're not learning anything as a profession, and it allows the profession to look at the outside and say, well, there's the problem, and we've gotten rid of the problem. When in fact, the problem lies within, and some of that problem has to do with complexity. And I think complexity in these decision makings and how information flows, even in some of the technologies that we've implemented, leave blind spots in our decision making and create the possibility for error and the possibility for repeated error across time and people. It seems that we're trying to, we have a complex problem. We have a problem in which we have to get information from people into a call center and then get it to the right responder out in the field. And that's complex. It's not simple. It seems simple, but it's not. There's an interpretation process on all sides. There's a communication process. We have automated systems. We have communication systems involved. And it is a very complex environment. And one of the things that I've noticed about a lot of the companies that have tried to come up with solutions is they've come up with complex solutions. And the risk in that is that we just multiply complexity. We're not making the decision environment simpler. Human beings tend to make the best decisions that they can in the moment, right? We don't typically, and again, there are exceptions, but most of us don't typically go to work to do a bad job. Officers don't go to work saying, you know, I'm going to misinterpret the situation, or I'm going to get into a shooting today. And so a lot of times the enemy of good outcomes is complexity. So I would look for ways, if I were to design a 911 system, to reduce the complexity as much as possible. And sometimes we can reduce the complexity for an individual operator by hiding it, right? And sometimes we hide it in our technology. That doesn't necessarily reduce complexity. It just means that when I have a couple of buttons to push, or if I have AI that's interpreting what's most important about a call, I'm not able to necessarily know what is or is not being taken care of. To me, one of the most innovative solutions or ideas that I've seen really is this live 911 idea, in which officers are starting to get exposed to actual information from the call earlier. And really my exposure to that has been through the Chula Vista Police Department, and just really just kind of on the periphery, and some phone calls and some information. But I think they're doing some interesting things with that live 911 response. Allowing officers to start to immerse themselves in that call starts to take out some of that interpretation process in between. Now, I think that call takers serve an incredibly important purpose, not trying to get rid of call takers in this process. Human beings, we need some of that discretionary decision making. So I did a follow-up study to the dispatch priming study. It's called Engineering Resilience. And I primed all of the officers in that study. I used the exact same dispatch call to prime all of the officers involved. And just by lowering their muzzle to a low ready position rather than a high ready position, it reduced the effect of the prime altogether. In fact, we got down to the control levels of error that we saw in the dispatch priming study when officers lowered their guns to a low ready position. And officers only lost 11/100ths of a second in their ability to respond to somebody who produced a gun. So what that tells me is that little tactical things that officers do in the street can make a tremendous difference in decision making, even when they have the wrong information. And the truth is, officers at some point will get the wrong information, right? We're never going to get it 100% right. And so really what we need to be engineering into our system is more resilience. We need to be engineering the ability to respond to situations that aren't what they seem, in a way that doesn't result in tragedy. We have to be really careful about how we constrain decision making and what it is that we do with decision making. I had one company approach me and they said, wouldn't it be great if we could put cameras on officers in real time and have a supervisor in a dispatch center who's able to make decisions for the officer in the street? Wouldn't that be fantastic? And I would say, no, that would be a horrible idea, because the dispatcher or the supervisor, no matter how experienced they are in a dispatch center, is not getting the same level of information, no matter how wide lens that camera is, as an officer is in the moment. They don't know what cues the officer is picking up on. They don't have all of the available information, and creating additional complexity between that decision-making process only leaves more room for error. It only leaves more room for problems. You look across the country, I won't give specific examples, but you look across the country and some of the most tragic outcomes in policing are coming out of places where we have put into place some of the most extensive policies and some of the most extensive kind of control mechanisms, where we're watching everything that's happening, where we've told people you've got to do better. But the problem is human beings are people. And in putting a 900-page policy manual out there, we create blind spots. We create issues that we don't necessarily understand and know. And so I would just really encourage administrations to look at people as a resource to solve problems rather than a liability to control. How can we simplify the decision-making environment for human beings who are dealing with complex problems? How can we, where possible, give people even fractions of a second in some instances to make better decisions? How can we remove some of the goal conflicts that we see in the workplace, because those are prevalent in a lot of environments. You know, one of the environments that comes to mind that has direct application here is situations in which you're dealing with somebody who's armed and who's presenting as suicidal, right? And that creates a significant goal conflict. It creates a goal conflict for the call taker, right? Because you've got somebody who's armed, but maybe you have some information that the person is suicidal. So how do you interpret that? How do you pass that information along? From an officer's standpoint, when they respond on scene, how do you approach that? Now, Oftentimes we've siloed the training for that. We've said, now we have de-escalation training and we have tactical training to deal with armed situations. An officer has to make a decision between the two. So how do we start to deconflict that? How do we prioritize those types of responses? Because they're both important. The armed aspect of that is important, and the tactics involved in that are important. The ability to de-escalate is important. I really think we need to start to unleash the decision-making and creativity of individuals, because these are, again, these are complex problems, and our tendency has been, and I call it panoptic Taylorism, right? We just want to watch people closer, and we tell them, don't do that anymore. We're very focused on behaviorism, but we're not looking at why we're seeing the behaviors that we're seeing. And now we're in a time period where body-worn cameras have been around for a while, right? And again, they're not a bad thing, but they're not a solution. They're not going to produce better outcomes, because they're not, the cause of the issue is not malicious. The cause of the issue is systemic. We see repeated outcomes across the country. They're rare, right? We don't see a lot of people getting, like, an agency may not have more than one controversial shooting over the course of its entire lifetime, right? But that one controversial shooting may be very much like another controversial shooting or another controversial decision-making process on the other side of the country. We're very siloed in the way that we look at these problems. And so there really tends to be two approaches. We either say, this is unique, it's happened here, we're going to investigate it here, and you can't compare it to any other. And that tends to be the practitioner approach to things, right? We say, you know, this is discretionary decision making, it's unique. The other approach is kind of the academic approach to these things. We tend to bring all of the cases that we can find together, and we tend to try to figure out what variables cause, for instance, police shootings, right, or some other outcome. Well, that would be like pulling all deaths in an ER together and say, what causes deaths in an ER? They are somewhat different, and yet there are systemic influences that weave their way through different types of incidents. And so we really have to take a more nuanced approach to the way we evaluate these outcomes, and the way we're looking for solutions to them. Oftentimes, I think it has to do with creating more resilience in that call response. We can't tell people, don't get yourself into a bad situation, because police officers are going to get themselves into bad situations. We can't tell people, don't ever stand that close to somebody, because you can't always interpret where you're going to end up. And so how do we build in responses that prevent that from becoming a bad outcome? And I would say that that's likely true in call centers as well. How we take calls, how we manage information, what produces an optimal outcome is going to be different, and creating situations in which people have the flexibility to make decisions, deconflicting where we can, conflicting goals, is going to improve outcomes. It's going to improve decision making.